The night was quiet, just the usual hum of the city and the occasional siren in the distance. Officer Bradley, a seasoned cop with a chip on his shoulder, had been patrolling this neighborhood for years. He thought he knew everything about the people who lived here, who belonged and who didn't. So when he saw a black man in a well-tailored suit standing outside a convenience store, checking his phone, something in him snapped. He pulled his squad car to the curb, his grip tightening on his baton as he stepped out. "Hey, hands where I can see them," Bradley barked, his voice laced with authority and suspicion. The man, calm and composed, looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "Excuse me." Bradley didn't like the tone. Too confident, too sure of himself. He was used to compliance, fear, not this measured calm. "I said hands up. What are you doing here?" The man sighed, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I'm waiting for someone. They're a problem, officer." Bradley's blood boiled. This guy was giving him attitude, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "You think you're smart, huh?" He stepped closer, his hand already reaching for his baton. Before the man could say another word, Bradley shoved him against the wall. The force of it made the man grunt, but he still didn't resist. Instead, he locked eyes with Bradley, his expression unreadable. That only made Bradley angrier. He pressed harder, his voice dropping to a warning. "You better start talking before I..." And then, the moment that changed everything. A voice crackled over Bradley's radio. "All units be advised. The new precinct captain is on site for an unannounced inspection. Stand by." Bradley barely registered the words. He was too focused on putting this guy in his place. But then the man smirked, just slightly, and with a measured, almost amused tone, he said, "You might want to check your radio, officer." Something about the way he said it made Bradley pause. His grip loosened slightly. He glanced down at the man's wrist. A sleek watch gleamed under the streetlight, one with a badge insignia on its face. His stomach dropped. A slow realization crept over him, and suddenly, everything, the anger, the authority, the control he thought he had, started slipping away. And then the man leaned in, just a little. "I was going to introduce myself properly," he said, voice steady, "but I think you just made that a whole lot more interesting." Bradley's heart pounded as the truth hit him. This wasn't just some random guy. This was his new boss. For a moment, Officer Bradley didn't move. His grip on the man's arm loosened slightly, but his mind was racing. No, this couldn't be real. This guy, this well-dressed, smooth-talking man he had just shoved against a wall, was his new captain. His boss? It didn't make sense. The man straightened his suit, brushing off the imaginary dust from his sleeve. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something sharp, something knowing. Bradley swallowed hard. The radio crackled again. "Captain Hughes, do you require assistance?" Bradley felt the blood drain from his face. The name hit him like a brick. Hughes, his new precinct captain, the man standing right in front of him. Captain Hughes exhaled, taking his time. "Negative. No assistance needed," he responded, his voice even. Bradley tried to think of something, anything to say. His throat was dry. "Sir, I..." But Hughes held up a hand, stopping him. Not in anger, not in rage, just control. "Not here," Hughes said quietly, glancing around. A couple of people had slowed their steps on the sidewalk, watching the scene with curiosity. The city never slept, and rumors moved fast. "Let's not put on a show, officer." Bradley nodded stiffly, feeling the weight of his uniform heavier than ever. Hughes turned and started walking toward a sleek, black SUV parked a few feet away. Bradley hesitated before following. His heart was still pounding, his thoughts racing. Was he about to be fired on the spot, suspended, maybe worse? As they reached the vehicle, Hughes opened the door but didn't get in. Instead, he turned to Bradley, arms crossed. The streetlights cast long shadows on his face, making his expression even harder to read. "You've been with this precinct a long time, haven't you?" Hughes asked finally. His voice was calm, but something in his tone told Bradley this wasn't just small talk. "Yes, sir," Bradley answered, standing straighter, trying to maintain some level of professionalism. "How long?" 10 years. Hughes nodded slowly. "And in those 10 years, how many times have you stopped someone like this?" Bradley hesitated. His jaw tightened. Sir, I thought." "You thought what?" Hughes interrupted, but his voice wasn't raised. "That I was a threat? That I didn't belong?" He let the words hang in the air. "Or would you just assume?" Bradley's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't have an answer, or at least, not one that he was willing to say out loud. Hughes studied him for a moment longer before exhaling, shaking his head slightly. "You've got a lot to think about, officer." And with that, he stepped into the SUV, shutting the door behind him, leaving Bradley standing there, his whole world suddenly feeling a lot smaller. Bradley stood there, watching the black SUV disappear down the street, his stomach twisted in knots. He had made a mistake, a big one. But what was worse than the mistake itself was the fact that he didn't even know how to fix it. His hands felt cold despite the warm night air, his mind replaying the last few minutes over and over. He had handled situations like this 100 times before, but this wasn't just another stop. This was different. The rest of his shift dragged on, but he barely heard the radio calls or noticed the usual hum of the city. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, making everything else feel distant. Every time he thought about what Hughes had said, "How many times have you stopped someone like this?" Something uncomfortable churned inside him. He didn't want to answer that question, not to himself, not to anyone. Back at the precinct, the usual chatter filled the squad room. Officers were coming and going, filing reports, cracking jokes, but Bradley felt out of place. He kept his head down, moving straight to his desk, but it wasn't long before someone approached him. "Hey, Bradley." It was Dawson, a fellow officer, and one of the few people he actually considered a friend. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Bradley let out a breath. "I might as well have." Dawson smirked and took a seat on the edge of the desk. "That bad, huh? What happened?" For a moment, Bradley debated telling him. Then, with a low voice, he said, "I had a run-in with the new captain." Dawson raised an eyebrow. "Already? Damn, what you do?" Bradley hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to say it out loud, but the words came out anyway. "I didn't exactly realize who he was." Dawson frowned, meaning. Bradley rubbed a hand down his face. "I stopped him, got in his face, thought he was." He cut himself off, shaking his head. Dawson didn't say anything right away. He just let out a slow breath and nodded. I see." Bradley glanced around the room, suddenly aware of how many people were in Urshut. "Look, I don't need a lecture." "I wasn't going to give you one," Dawson said, but his tone was unreadable. "Just be careful. Hughes isn't like the last guy. He's got a reputation." Bradley frowned. "What kind of reputation?" Dawson glanced around before leaning in slightly. "The kind that doesn't let things slide." Bradley's stomach twisted again. He didn't know what that meant exactly, but he had a bad feeling he was about to find out. Bradley barely slept that night. Even after his shift ended, the conversation with Hughes and Dawson replayed in his head on an endless loop. He had spent years on the force, but something about this was different. He wasn't just dealing with a bad call or an angry civilian. This was his career, his reputation, his future. And Hughes, he wasn't the kind of man to let things go. By the time he walked into the precinct the next morning, there was an uneasy tension in the air. Officers who usually nodded in greeting barely met his eyes. Whispers followed him as he moved through the hall. His stomach tightened. Had Hughes already said something? Was he about to get pulled into the captain's office and handed his suspension papers? He kept walking, trying to ignore the weight of the stairs. But as he turned the corner, he stopped in his tracks. Hughes was there, standing by the front desk, reviewing some files. He looked just as composed as he had the night before, sharp suit, steady gaze, completely unreadable. But when he lifted his eyes and saw Bradley, something flickered in them. Recognition, a quiet challenge. Bradley forced himself to keep moving, pretending nothing was wrong. He had just reached his desk when another voice cut through the noise. "Bradley, in my office." "Hughes." Bradley frowned. "Sir?" Hughes tilted his head slightly. "It's a simple question. Are you a good cop?" Bradley straightened in his chair. "I do my job. I protect this city." Hughes nodded slowly, as if considering that answer. "And last night, were you protecting the city?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "I made a mistake." "A mistake." Hughes repeated the word like he was testing its weight. Then, after a pause, he leaned forward. "You saw a black man standing outside a store and assumed he was a threat. You didn't ask questions. You didn't stop to think. You just acted. Tell me, officer, was that a mistake or a habit?" Bradley felt his breath catch. Hughes held his gaze, the weight of his words pressing down like a heavy hand on Bradley's chest. "You see, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was," he continued, his voice calm but firm. "The problem is that if I hadn't been your captain, if I had just been another man on the street, that night could have ended very differently." The air in the room felt thick, the tension unbearable. "Now," Hughes said, straightening up, "I have a decision to make." Bradley's fingers curled into fists. His career, his future, everything was hanging in the balance, and he had no idea which way it was about to fall. Bradley could feel his pulse in his throat. Hughes's words lingered in the air, heavy and sharp. A decision to make. That could mean anything. A suspension. A transfer. Maybe worse. His whole career was balancing on a nice edge, and he didn't know which way it would tip. But then, just as he was about to say something, anything, to defend himself, there was a knock at the door. "Captain, you need to see this," a voice called from outside. Hughes exhaled slowly, his eyes still locked on Bradley before finally breaking away. "Give me a minute," he called back. Bradley sat frozen, unsure if he should take this as an escape or brace for something worse. Hughes grabbed a folder from his desk, flipping it open. His expression shifted slightly as he scanned the pages, something unreadable flashing across his face. Then he looked up at Bradley. "You know Marcus Haynes?" Bradley frowned. "Who?" Hughes tapped the folder. "He filed a complaint against you last year. Said you pulled him over for no reason, searched his car, made him sit on the curb for nearly an hour before letting him go. Does that ring a bell?" Bradley's stomach twisted. The name was vaguely familiar, but the details were hazy. He had pulled over a lot of people in his career. Hughes studied his face. "You never got disciplined for it. The complaint was dropped. Want to know why?" Bradley didn't answer. He wasn't sure he wanted to. "Because the report disappeared." Hughes shut the folder, and it wasn't the only one. A cold chill ran down Bradley's spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's a pattern, officer," Hughes said, his voice steady but firm. "And patterns like this, they don't just happen." He let that sink in for a second before continuing. "The only reason this conversation is happening in my office and not in front of the review board is because I wanted to look you in the eye first." Bradley opened his mouth to argue, to push back, but the words caught in his throat. His mind was racing. Reports disappearing. Complaints being wiped away. That wasn't him. He did his job. He enforced the law. Then it hit him. The precinct. The culture. The unspoken rule that officers looked out for each other. His own record had been kept clean, not because he was blameless, but because someone had made sure of it. "Why are you telling me this?" Bradley finally asked. Hughes leaned forward. "Because I need to know something before I make my decision." His voice dropped lower, almost daring Bradley to flinch. "Are you just another cop who lets the system protect him, or are you willing to face the truth?" Before Bradley could answer, the knock came again, louder this time. "Captain, it's urgent." Hughes exhaled and moved to the door. The moment he opened it, another officer stepped inside, his face tight with worry. "You need to come downstairs," he said quickly. "There's someone asking for you, says he has proof." Hughes frowned. "Proof of what?" The officer hesitated before answering. "Says he can prove there are dirty cops in this precinct." The room went silent, and then Hughes's gaze flicked back to Bradley. The weight in his stare said it all. This wasn't just about one bad stop. This was bigger. And now, Bradley wasn't just part of the problem, he was right in the middle of it. Bradley's heart pounded as Hughes turned back to him. There was no mistaking the shift in his expression. This had just become bigger than the two of them. The officer at the door shifted uneasily. "The guy downstairs, he says he has records, files, proof that complaints have been buried, reports erased." His voice dropped slightly. "He says it's not just one or two cases. He says it's a cover-up." Hughes didn't move for a second. Then, with a slow nod, he glanced at Bradley once more. "You're coming with me." Bradley stiffened. "What? Why?" "Because if this is what I think it is, you're part of it, whether you knew it or not." Bradley swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. He stood up and followed Hughes through the precinct, feeling the weight of every stare as they passed. They reached the lobby, where a man stood nervously near the front desk, clutching a folder so tightly his knuckles were white. He was young, mid-20s, with wary eyes that darted around the room like he expected someone to throw him out at any moment. Hughes stepped forward. "You asked for me." The man nodded quickly. "Yeah, I have something you need to see." He glanced at Bradley, then back at Hughes. "But not here. Too many ears." Hughes didn't hesitate. "My office. Now." The three of them made their way back upstairs, the silence stretching as thick as the tension. When they got inside, Hughes shut the door and gestured for the man to sit. "Start talking," Hughes said. The man hesitated, glancing at Bradley again. "I don't know if I can trust him." Hughes didn't blink. "If you couldn't, you wouldn't be sitting here." That seemed to be enough. The man took a breath and opened the folder. Inside were pages of reports, some with red stamps across them, others barely filled out before being discarded. "These are complaints filed against officers in this precinct," the man explained, flipping through them. "Most of them never made it past the initial review process. They just disappeared." Bradley leaned in, his stomach tightening. Some of the names were familiar. Some of them were his. Hughes picked up one of the reports, scanning it carefully. "How did you get these?" "I used to work in records. My job was filing reports, looking at. But you need to understand, this is bigger than just a few bad cops. You start pulling at this thread, you don't know what it'll unravel." Bradley felt the weight of those words. The system had protected him for years, even when he didn't realize it. How many others had been shielded? How deep did this really go? Hughes folded his arms. "You're telling me to look the other way." Reynolds didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Bradley looked at the folder on Hughes' desk. The proof was there. The truth was staring him in the face. He had spent years thinking he was doing the right thing, that he was serving the law. But now he realized, the law only worked if the people enforcing it had integrity. He stood up. "I can't be part of this anymore." His voice was steady, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Whatever happens, I want to make it right." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, then shook his head. "You have no idea what you're stepping into." Hughes held his ground. "Then I guess we'll find out." The tension hung in the air for a long moment. Then Reynolds straightened his jacket, gave them both a final look, and walked away without another word. Bradley watched him go, his mind racing. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know how deep the corruption ran. But for the first time, he was ready to find out.